and it's my deep pleasure. Oops. I just got the recording in progress message, got through it. Okay. Try that again. It's my pleasure to moderate this session along with Paul Moss. And the session is titled Perspectives of an Accidental Animist, for which our featured speaker is Jarid Manos. Jarid is an American writer, activist, and vegan athlete. He is author of Ghetto Plainsman, which I can't recommend highly enough to everyone, and which is being made into a Hollywood feature film. Congratulations, Jarid. He's also publishing an upcoming collection of short stories titled The Sun and the Water, as well as a novel titled Her Blue Watered Streets. Jarid is also founder of the nonprofit organization Great Plains Restoration Council, which is helping create the largest public prairie preserve in North Texas, and also founder of two ecological health initiatives, one called Restoration, Not Incarceration, and the other called Shark Therapy. Jarid has expressed to us his deep desire to not be a talking head and to make just a short presentation for us because he wants the bulk of our time here to be interactive. We encourage you all to start posting questions right away using the Q&A function rather than the chat. Try to keep it organized there. And my co-moderator, Paul Moss, is going to be helping me to field your questions as they come through. So without further ado, turn it over to Jarid. Thank you.
Hey, what's up, everybody? So I guess, like, you know, the way I look at it is a lot of times that we're almost conditioned to think of our lives as flat. And for me, my life has been a kind of almost like the universe, you know, it's been, as you pull back, a sense of ever expanding, you know, awareness and consciousness. And, I think that just a lot of times, like the way that for whatever reason that I end up like what you would call an animist, an animist is somebody who has this ingrained sense that there is like a spirit or a living energy in all things, you know, plants, animals, rocks, weather systems, and stuff like that. And how I became more aware of that was like a process over my life. And, you know, when, I guess one thing that I would ask is like, how many times have you ever, how many of y'all have ever walked up the stairs of an old house and you heard a couple of those stairs creak, and you know what it became, you know, that's an example of you're really stepping on an after expression of that tree as you're going up that old house. And so when I became, something like that would allow me to, I started seeing that there was like more of a presence in a lot of these, a lot of the world around us. When I was little, you know, son of immigrants growing up in the upper Midwest, I would, my first consciousness of that I remember about the world around me was I was riding my bike doing my little paper route, and freezing, you know, probably 0 degrees. I started seeing these telephone poles, and one after the other, then I started, you know, freaking out. I said, oh my God, these are trees. And that was my first ecological consciousness. I'm out there freezing, and I realized that's the earliest ecological consciousness that I had. Early on, when I was around 3 years old, I cracked my head open, fall over backwards. And sometimes as I thought about it, maybe it has opened up some additional sensitivity. And since then, I've had a couple more head injuries, and it just has allowed me over a period of time a greater sensitivity. You know, I was, before I became a Texan and moved out past into the open country, I was surrounded by, I was in what used to be the woods part, the forest part of America. And I kind of had a sense of that, but there was, you know, it was like, before I even knew the whole history of America and the Indian battles or Underground Railroad or whatever like that, I would be out there in these kind of dead, depleted, shot out woods, and I would have a sense that there had been something there more, and it was like two worlds alternating, And then I did start doing a little research. I said, wait, right there were wolves and buffalo and elk, and there was an old 400-year-old white oak tree, and I realized right under that tree, and that tree was still on, big and vital. That tree had. People had, like Shawnee folks had fires under there, and it felt to me like that tree had like absorbed those stories. And what I came to realize that the American story is particularly the story of people on the land, and those stories are embedded like layers of sandstone. The history is not over with, and so our lives, even as we are now today, are adding new layers and new stories to that. As a writer, I started paying attention to. We were talking about Toni Morrison and Beloved, and that is a real pungent novel to me. Another 360 participation, because whether it's the sycamore tree that Paul D was before at Sweet Home, or the chokecherry, I feel like some of these plants and some of these a lot of times we're acculturated to think that the world around us is just flat, and you see it in literature. Have you ever read the book Where the Red Fern Grows? It's a pretty well-known American. You're smiling, Paul. But there's a guy there who his dogs they trap a raccoon way up in this ancient sycamore, and by hand he decided to cut it down. And he did not. As I read that, it was a pretty coming-of-age, heart-wrenching book. But he started thinking, well, what about that tree? The tree was just an obstacle to cut down. It was a test of his manhood to cut down through that. So, it's as I started, the layers started pressing in onto my life. Then I got out of the woods and I went out to open country, and I was blazed by sun, wind, grass, and blue sky, and into Texas and all that. And you saw that in these, then you saw the prairies of America, those which were left. They had really, people think of prairies as like a wasteland, but so much of their life is underground, as well as the plants that reach up to the sky, and even the sunflowers. They'll follow, these native sunflowers will follow the sun from morning to noon to night. And so what it became to me as the world became, it's almost like I'm tripping. In my life, I became like a sense of all this world around me, and whether it was good or bad, I became hypersensitized to the traumas as well as the expressions of the world. So when I approached ecological work, I created my nonprofit organization, Great Plains Restoration Company. From a personal standpoint, I had my ups and downs, and I thought I could find refuge in nature, but I found more trauma than that, and more hatred, ugliness, and violence. And so I said, well, I would like to create something that kind of took away the sense of the objectivity of the environment and the natural world, the sense that there's just kind of like a top-down. I think that there's just us telling them about them rather than us participating. So that's kind of like what I wanted to create, something where we built a new culture of caring and a sort of sense of participation. When we say being ecosystem participants in our work, we're looking at being part of that community. And even in the hood or anywhere like that, we're still on the prairie. We still share the same sun, storms, wind, and water. So a lot of my work has to do with building those, reawakening those participations, as well as building those connections. And I'll say, like, this is a crowd that knows about difference between native ecosystems and invasive species and degraded places. And if you ever look, when America is pretty degraded, and we have some places that are really still strong and intact. that rather than being pieces or parts of a surviving place, there's an energy to, ancient, still living ecosystems. Like in the Fort Worth Prairie, that's whatever is left. It's 10,000 years old. And so when you're out there, every step every step reveals another story. And it's completely contradictory to what the Texas General Land Office said was 2 pieces of dirt, referring to these thousands of acres on either side of the road. And I mean, I've been to Indian Canyon out in Palm Springs. You go up in there and or you go Pepper Creek out in the backcountry or Pine Ridge or some of these places. And the plant communities are expressing themselves as a whole in a community that really strikes your spirit. And so being aware of that is rather than just objectifying the nature. And it's almost like when they're when they're together, it's like Morehouse or Howard step dance or a power or something. There's a song and spirit and story to that community versus just a few survivors of plants and things like that. So that's kind of been how I want to work towards us being more part of the community of all living things. So that's a lot of and I think that some of this animism is people think of it as something that's out there, but it predates a lot of organized religions. And in some places, like even in some of my ancestral lands in North Africa, it's still part of an organized religion, but I kind of came to it just by ever increasing layers of awareness. And you ever heard of the term jinn or jinni in Arabic or African Arabic? That whitewashed TV show, I Dream of Jeannie? It's actually, jinn is a plural of jinni, Jinni, and this talked about both good or sometimes malevolent spirits. So I have, over a period of time, in not some kind of crazy way, but just I've become kind of more aware of those things. And really for us is just to be able, we need to just be able to allow others the opportunity to express themselves. That's kind of what I would like to see the ecological movement and some, plant biodiversity work, all of, I would love to see more conversations going where if we're building a new culture of caring, I would like to see us making space for the expression of others. And that's a 360-degree world there. So that's kind of where a lot of what I do in both my work and both as far as a writer and as an activist. And I will say one thing, by this September, I'll be a vegan athlete for 24 years. And so I want us to, plant-based nutrition has kept me alive after a lot, life has kind of knocked me around a lot. But I want, I think that as we move into these open, more expansive areas of consciousness, I want to be on guard for these conversations to not be co-opted by industrial meat and factory farms that's so horrible to people and animals and the environment. Because I think on both sides, I saw the other day on social media say, plants don't have feelings. And this is from a vegan, comparing that to some of the problems. We don't have a right to say what others feel or think. We should just listen. And it's not like, when I'm making I had a beet, turmeric, ginger, and red grape organic juice this morning. It's not like I created beet ninjacide in my nutrable. I'm aware of what, I'm not saying that we have to go overboard or whatever like that. I think that just kind of less seeing the world as objects and being more in our flesh and blood culture and soul part of the plant world. And I think that will open up a lot of where we might be able to go in terms of certainly building a new culture of caring, because as you know, we're in the extinction crisis and most people think of the earth still as something that's just there. So that's kind of where I think I'll get into this a little bit later, but there's I have a 19-month-old baby boy, and it's when we take him, he lives up with his two mothers up in Atlanta, and when we take him to this forest, there's no electronics or like that, and I'm watching him, everything is pressing on him. He's kind of aware of the world around, especially, and the more that it's like a native vital place, he has no idea any of these stories yet of the traumas or good stories in America. He has no idea, nothing. He has no idea that people are going to hate him because of the way he looks. He doesn't know, never heard of the Civil War or anything like that. He's just a little baby boy, and he's starting to express his world. And just this week, he's starting to say his first few words, and it just really kind of struck me because it's like mysterious and wonderful, like you're establishing contact with almost like with another being from out there in the universe. And it was is that moving into that connection, and then how you take that further forward kind of is like maybe a story for ourselves as we try to connect deeper with the natural world while we still have time. So that's kind of my perspective. And when I walk down the street, it's weird, but I'm totally aware of what's around me. And if it's live oaks, if it's, plants do this a lot. And I'm not being crazy. I don't even say this publicly, but it's really weird. Like I'm very aware of the world around me. And it's not just something that I'm passing by, but as you're walking, all these living beings that are whispering and expressing themselves. And maybe it's because I've had a couple head injuries or increased my level of consciousness, but it can be exhausting sometimes, but also because it's like sensory overload, but it's kind of how I inhabit the world. So that's maybe that I can be a doorway in some ways for people. That's pretty much like my perspective of accidental enemies.
Oh, thanks very much, Jarid. That's really interesting, and thanks for sharing that. I'm wondering, when you're talking about I hope people will post some questions or comments, but just one thing that struck me is, if we, do you think that people would treat other beings better if they felt or realized that they were conscious? Because the reason I ask it is that people don't treat other people very well, and we know that they're conscious. So, but I'm wondering, do you think would it help, in terms of the way they're treated?
Well, I hate to have any broad strokes, but if I was pushed to it, I'd say there's givers and takers in this world. And the givers are trying to say, we are here, and create this larger sense of community and ecosystem belonging. So yes, on the other side, and there are those who hunger to hurt. It leaves me speechless. And I think that there are those who never, ever evolve. They go through they might devolve their whole life. You're talking about a baby. That baby wasn't born to act demonically or whatever. So all we can do, to answer your question, is in real grounded ways, model ever expanding consciousness and just be aware of not being, again, co-opted about that, but just saying like, this is where ecology is a final and greatest social struggle, because at its heart, it demands the interconnectedness of all living things, of all things, period. So that encompasses that. And we're Fred Davey, he's the senior executive vice president at Union Theological Seminary in New York, has worked in previous presidential administration. He says maybe in 100 years we'll get to a place of mutuality. All of the work that we do has to be brushstrokes in that painting. I don't have the answer exactly, because some people are unreachable, but then there are some who are. So all we can do is do our part, and we don't have to do everything, but be conscious. If you see the whole rest of your life, and even our time period, as a beautiful painting, that we do these brushstrokes.
Well, hearing your perspective, Jarid, is helping me to understand so much more richly what you're talking about in your book, Ghetto Plainsman. I have a million questions myself, but I see that Allison has posted one in the Q&A, so I'll read it to you and invite you to respond. Allison writes, I'm really curious about how you stay open when you experience the trauma that other beings suffer. How do you resource yourself?
Well, if I wasn't vegan, that I can honestly say for that and absorbing that, I'm thankful for that energy. That certainly has kept me alive. I've been long been dead for that. So that's one thing. You know, I do practice mindfulness, and I'm not. At one point, I did think I was Superman, but you know, even Superman had his weakness, and you know, a long time ago, I made a promise, you know, and I thought that I was going to make my life matter because, you know, long time ago, and I stuck to that. You know, you read my book, so it was like so I come back to that, and I've had my, you know, sometimes I've had my, I practice unbreakability, and I help our young Black and brown men in my restoration and incarceration program develop unbreakability, and you have to come back to it and work on yourself. In the last few years, particularly during the previous administration, and sometimes you have personal stuff that happens to you too. It can break you, but you know, we're always stronger than we think we are. So I try to, you know, I practice mindfulness. I try to get out. I ride my bike, go to the gym, swim. When I'm in my writer's residence in Florida, I get in the water. You know, and a lot of times it's really difficult to, even when you're out in the ocean, you know. Lately, it's been hard not to see the plastic instead of the ocean. And I'm really, so my thing now is really, really, you know, intentionally practicing mindfulness and, you know, trying, you know, stopping negative thinking and attacking negative thinking like something that I think has your best interest. And then you have all these other layers, because sometimes if you walk in certain places, you might get stopped or harassed by police or whatever like that. So I'm kind of used to the world as a war zone. I just have to, like in my earlier days, I decided, well, if there is no safe place, I have to work to create safe places. And then I did see, just like, you know, Prairie Dogs, they're my friends, and poison gas or shot from 5 billion down to scattered numbers. Every single day, they get up and worship the sun. And so, you know, I try to step from that beauty and vitality, those flashpoints in a sea of hatred, ugliness, and violence. And then I fill my veins that way, if that's helpful.
You mentioned like Suzanne Simard did about the mother tree, about really old trees, that 400-year-old oak being something that really gives you like a sense of, I don't know, life connectedness, meaning, all those wonderful things. But you also in your book, there is a figure, an older woman figure that seems African, seems maybe an ancestor. And I wonder about that, because this is just coming from my own interests and my own experience of being a child of immigrants from Western Ireland, where connections not just to the spirit world, but also to the dead are still quite lively and quite very much a source of strength, as I think is true of most colonized people, if not all. Could you talk to us about the connection to the dead and how death is also maybe a formative part of your experience? I mean, you write so movingly about the slaughter of the prairie dogs that it was very hard to read. But on the other hand, it seems to have galvanized you into a much better place than you were at to have witnessed that trauma.
Yeah, I went to jail for prairie dogs locking down the line of fire instead of some of the other stuff I was involved with, like, but it's funny, like prairie dogs, they're a perfect example of resilience. And I think that's kind of what we have to say. That the experience of the dead is really important. And again, this is this is something that I have, because a lot of these things are more, what did somebody say once, that certain animals like wolves and dogs communicate more symphonically versus than like, say, a octopus or a dolphin or which is kind of more analytical. And so this space that you're talking about is hard for me. It's kind of like God. It's kind of hard to put human words around it. But the figure the woman you mentioned, wrapped in her robes in the sands of the north of Africa, I would sometimes have this sense of her coming in and out, and I'm really tied to to those moments. Honestly, like in April 2019, I was on my bike and a car knocked me down. We backed up fast and I had another head injury. Wasn't even going fast, but since then, things have even gotten more increased. And lately, yesterday, I was thinking that maybe I'm already dead. My body just doesn't know it. And I don't know if you guys are up in the north. You probably have heard of Rosalie Little Thunder, the Sicangu Lakota elder up in South Dakota. She told me, she worked with my organization for a while, but she told me once that, she's passed now, but she said the elders, the older people she knew when she was a kid, she said that after they were in a car going down the road fast, when they got out, they had to stop, and they would stand there for a brief second to let their spirit catch up to them. So I don't have all the answers to that, but I am looking to explore the concept of Jinn and Jinni and some of my ancestral callings. I'm an open country person. I was pulled out into the open country, and I, found out, after the fact that the Sahara used to be a prairie and a grassland up until about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And in Niger, Bonnie Choi's book, Why We Swim, she talked about free divers in the water in the lakes of Niger. And so when I'm particularly interested in the time before Muhammad and the expanded story of journey on the land. And after I get through these two books, I'm actually going to explore that through the human story out east in this book called I Could Be a Desert. So I don't have all the answers to it, but I definitely think that I can just kind of tell you through stories. One time when I was in Houston, I was, before it was renovated, I was taken as a small group of people to the Levi Jordan plantation. It's a horrible, horrible place. But there's the big house, and it hadn't been renovated yet. So there wasn't any veneer or anything over the wood. And now it's like a plantation house. And when I went in there, those old wood steps were absorbing. I felt direct connected to the 1800s. And they took you out to the back, and there was in the back is where they raised Black folks like cattle. And so they had a big, and they were breeding them actually. It was really, and so all these things were just too much sensory overload. And as they had done the archaeological digs of it, there were pieces of copper, and there were a place where they had put posts that had brought some of their African traditions in terms of, the directions and stuff like that. And that was in that degraded coastal prairie, was turned to sugarcane, which was turned to cotton. The dead wasn't dead. It was still there. So all I can say is those stories are there. I'm here to listen. I don't have the answers.
I found it so hard, though, for me, as a lifelong academic, and, in this institutional environment that shaped me into thinking that rational, logical, analytical thinking is privileged over all of these other ways of knowing. it's been very hard for me to undo that over the years and to get into this place where I appreciate that that's a very poisonous way of thinking. And it's linked directly to these toxic behaviors that we engage in all the time, these self-destructive behaviors. So it's wonderful for me to read your story and to see, I don't know, in a kind of parallel lives kind of way that you didn't have to really endure that. You kicked yourself out of school as fast as you could run, it seems, which is a great thing in many ways. That said, what Paul was talking about in his session about getting the mentality changed in a productive, good, new direction towards plant ecology especially, but all these other wonderful things that I think we're all interested in. Tell us how you are working as an educator in a way that's different from that educational model that didn't work for you as a child, especially.
So, we do conservation through people, and we're the founders of the Ecological Health Initiative, and actually it was the Archibald Bush Foundation up there in St. Paul was one of the main starter funders for that to help us really to develop that. But ecological health is the interdependent health of people, animals, and ecosystems. And so a lot of it on the prairie, our work is primarily on the prairie, but we help, we are sharing it nationwide, and we do help others such as the Atlanta Urban Forest. A lot of the work requires on the ground, it requires restoration, and so some of that involves killing of invasives, and so just an aside from it, I kind of shut off that, so I'm doing this for the community of the native ecosystem, which is endangered. But I think that as far as for education, participatory education is what's functional and effective for us, and we always all of the struggles that we're going through and that we have in our lives are related to the natural world, and one helps the other. Some of these broader themes like live like a watershed. We all live downstream, bloodstreams and creeks. The tensility of natives if you're on the Houston coastal prairie and you're just remove all these invasive Chinese towels, and then you give the seeds that were still in the soil, like rattlesnake master and some of your sunflowers and little blue stems, come up for that. You can use the participatory action of building refuge to remove that flattened perception of the world. So by taking care of others, we take care of ourselves. Ecological health has 3 tiers. It starts with basic knowledge and retention. Then there's teamwork and application. Then there's leadership and teaching. And you can use it a lot for people who are vulnerable to, say, their shatter moments, which is a lot of times where you can't think and something's happening and you break and you hurt others or yourself or both at the same time. But if you're out there rebuilding health, rebuilding refuge, becoming part of this totally textured, hyper-biodiverse landscape and building that health back, you put your body into that, and that then becomes much more indelible part of education. And it can be used as therapeutic modalities.
We have probably just time for about one more topic, but I'm interested. You've been a visionary for a long time in terms of the vision of restoring the whole Great Plains, and also in terms of your organization and otherwise. And I'm wondering, in terms of thinking about plants and the rights for plants or respect for plants, what kind of role for vision is there in that? What is vision important for movements, or how do you see such a movement evolving?
For sure, I think that first of all, when you take people out to ancestral native prairie. And people go out there after about 15 minutes, they start to say, I had no idea. So again, there was colonizing or preconceived, there was preconceived stereotypes and concepts about this. So again, participation in that. I think that becoming, when you talk about expanding the level of consciousness, you have in just one type of prairie ecosystem, 1,000 or more different plants who all have their own stories and all have, and their, and how they interact again like a community. Those are more of the stories that we have to tell. You know, the science is so important, but the human story is the 98% that's going to bring the rest of the people. One of the first things that I got involved with was the Arctic Refuge, the wildest and largest remaining grassland in the Western Hemisphere. People were talking about stats, well, 6 months of oil, but I'm like, well, this living and breathing, it provides so much refuge. You know, birds all the way even from Antarctica fly all the way up exhausted to go in and nest there in the sacred place where life begins. Same on the Fort Worth Prairie. Those monarchs, when I see them come up to all our diverse, you know, our different types of milkweed, and in the spring, all the scales have fallen off. They're so tired, but they came to this place of refuge. You know, in the fall, when this next generation comes down from Canada, they refuel there because all these different, every few weeks, there's another layer of flowers and plants that come up and express themselves. So we're not using this type of language enough to allow people to see it, you know, the plant world as an extension of our community and all living things. That's storytelling and being a part of it and opening people to the idea of it. Even the difference between the problems with invasive species and you know, you could take the story of prairie grasses, which can be the roots can go 8 feet down the ground, show them a cut bank, and you see that layer of carbon, which is a life force that's been there for thousands of years. You destroy it, that goes into the atmosphere, but over time, the prairie just keeps on doing what it really did so perfectly. People haven't talked about, you know, prairie, just like prairie, they found something that worked, and they, you know, through the hot and cold and seasons, they have continued to do what they did. And there's this level of patience and tenacity in plants that we haven't appreciated.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Do you have any last comments you'd like to make, Susan?
Oh, I just want to thank you, Jarid, for leading us into this wonderful discussion and for sharing your work with us. I just find it so inspiring. And I think, again, shameless plug for you, man. Everyone should be reading this as soon as possible. Don't wait for the movie, says the literature professor. And honestly, I think the plan, Paul, is to move immediately on to the wrap-up remarks session. Is that right?
Right, in about 5 minutes. And we'll wrap this up and let people kind of make a transition. But thank you so much again, everyone, and for participating, and Jarid and Susan, and very, very interesting and helpful discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks for all you're doing, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Be safe out there. All right.
Bye.